Hello everyone, welcome to Random Economics. Today, we are going to use the logic of peak oil anxiety to explain observable phenomenon that takes place in Bangladesh. More than 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and every bit of it is mined from Earth. That is another way of saying that all the fossil fuels humankind will ever have are already here, waiting to be extracted from the ground. Yet, since the day of pit hole in 1865, people have disagreed whether the world has an adequate stock of fossil fuel. The notion that the stock of fossil fuels will run out is called peak oil, and it is defined as the moment in history when the global production will reach a halfway point where 50% of all the recoverable resources will be used up and the production will begin to fall. At that moment, terminal depletion begins, and the era of cheap oil, on which so much depends, will be over. This concept was credited to geologist Marion King Hubbert. Going through the history of waves of panic, we can fairly say that peak oil anxiety has become embedded in the culture. Fear of running out of fossil fuels has been driving imperialist forays, stoking hatred among nations, and fueling war. This anxiety induced United States and the European powers to control every drop of oil in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Obviously, we're going to run out of oil in the long term. There's only so much oil we can mine and burn. It's tautological. We must have a sustainable energy transport and energy infrastructure in the long term.
The frenzy is rational, considering the Earth is finite, so the amount of energy it contains must also be finite, right? Well, no. A petroleum reserve is not a subterranean pool, but rather an imprecisely defined zone of permeable sponge-like rock that has petroleum in its pores. No one knows how much oil the world may eventually be able to recover. If engineers can develop new equipment that can pump out more petroleum at a lower cost, the effective size of the reservoir increases. Moreover, the petroleum a nation can produce depends on the national and international policies. These are all global production plateaus that have nothing to do with reserves. In strict terms, the fossil fuel supplies are infinite. Bangladesh is facing similar peak oil anxiety in terms of natural gas. The current gas demand is 3.7 billion cubic feet per day, whereas the gas supply is 2.7 billion cubic feet per day. 27 gas fields have been discovered in Bangladesh since 1955, of which 2 are offshore. In 1993, the initial estimated recoverable gas reserve was 12.4 trillion cubic feet. The reserve has increased over the years. In parallel, 16.9 trillion cubic feet gas has already been produced, leaving only 11.76 trillion cubic feet reserve. The entire local production comes from onshore gas fields. The country's oil and gas exploration activities in the offshore areas are still limited to only some shallow water blocks. Currently, Bangladesh has a total of 31 open blocks for offer in the next production sharing contract bidding. Of them, 9 blocks are in onshore areas, 14 in deep sea, and 8 in shallow sea areas. In 2015, BAPEX announced to drill 55 exploratory wells in 5 years. However, only 6 exploratory wells have been drilled so far by BAPEX. Two recently relinquished offshore gas blocks remain unexploited as the government has to spend about 1.7 billion annually to import 4 million metric tons of LNG to meet domestic gas demands. The expectation that the reserve can grow and new reserves could be added does not generate enough room in the mind of the energy specialist. This is due to the lack of foresightness that a sustainable and long-term exploration campaign could change the way we take for granted the scenario of depleting gas resources. The Bengal Delta has a hydrocarbon-bearing sediment structure with rich mineral deposits. The Bangladesh Delta is least likely to be exhausted of gas because the deltas throughout the world tend to be rich in gas and oil. Reserve growth ceases at a time in future depending on the maturity stage of exploration. But for an area like Bangladesh, where exploration is far from reaching a mature stage, it is naive to presume that the gas demand would be exhausted after the consumption of presently known reserves. There is no denying that Bangladesh has been facing critical gas supply situation for the last 5 years due to the discouraging performance in exploration, exploitation, and extraction of gas from unexplored reserves. New exploration, along with detailed digital reservoir characterization technique, needs to be carried out before drawing the conclusion of natural gas reserve will run out soon.